Okay. So we may have some people joining us throughout the session, but for the sake of time, I'm going to have to get started. So thank you all for joining us today's session. TASA MEM's conversations about refugee and migration policy, how to partner with and influence policymakers. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on today. For me, that is the Kaurna people here in the Greater Adelaide region. I'd like to acknowledge this land was never ceded. I would also like to acknowledge all the different Aboriginal lands that our panelists across Australia are meeting on today, and pay my respects to all their elders, both past, present, and emerging. We would like to acknowledge today's presentation will be recorded again, so for those who were unable to join us today, so feel free to turn your cameras off if you don't want your image to potentially be captured. So my name is Sarah. I'm a member of the TASA MEM postgrad team and your host for today's session. Conversations about sessions are a joint collaboration between the Australian Sociological Association's Migration, Ethnicity and Multiculturalism thematic group. And today we're partnering with the Comparative Network on Refugee Externalization Policies, CONREP. We also like to thank UniSA and particularly the University of Melbourne for providing us with the technical support for this event. TASA MEM has been running these virtual conversations about sessions since early 2020 and provides postgrad students and early career researchers the opportunity to engage more deeply with contemporary migration research challenges, and aims to discuss important issues and considerations arising in research surrounding migration, multiculturalism, refugee settlement, integration, and diversity. So as many of you noticed in our brief, today's session focuses on the contemporary research landscape, where there's increased emphasis on research demonstrating industry relevance or societal application. So moving beyond personal interests or human curiosity, research is increasingly expected to help address real-world problems or contribute to the work being done by industries that might sit outside of traditional academia. And so today we're honored to introduce three esteemed panelists that will help us to address many of the questions surrounding how to partner with and influence industry partners in today's scholarly research, while also providing some practical tips to postgraduate and early career researchers who are at various points in their academic journey. So today we are joined by Goshu Tefera, a PhD student candidate from Monash University, Dr. David Radford from the University of South Australia, and Annabelle Brown from the Centre for Policy Development. So how today will run is that the speakers will present on the issue for about 15 minutes each. Following their presentations, we will then open the floor for the audience to ask any questions, which you can do by either typing them in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, or by raising the hand icon at the end of all presentations. Feel free to put your questions into the chat box as we go throughout the session, but for the sake of continuity and time, we do ask that you please hold your verbal questions until after all the presentations have finished, and we will try to get to all of them. You will need to raise your hand icon so that we can manually unmute you for this part of this program. Any questions that do not get answered today, we are more than happy to help share with the panelists to be answered at a later date, should you wish it. So if you would like to tweet during this event, we also invite you to use the hashtags #TASAMEM or #CONREP and #conversationsabout. And you can feel free to tag TASA MEM and CONREP in your tweet. So we can also put those in the chat box for you as well, so you can reference them as we go. So to first up, we would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Goshu Tefera. So Goshu is a PhD candidate at Monash University. His recently submitted thesis explored the displacement, transit, and settlement experiences of Ethiopian refugees in Australia. Currently, Goshu is working as the Strategic Partnerships Coordinator for a Victoria government-funded program that aims to support settlement and inclusion of multicultural communities, hosted by La Trobe Community Health Services. Goshu's role includes working with various multicultural organizations and communities across Gippsland to develop and deliver initiatives and projects that address access and capacity issues after approval and under the guidance of the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. So thank you very much for your time, Goshu, and feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to have that conversation. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Goshu, and it's great to see some familiar faces today, and also new faces. But I'd like to acknowledge first the traditional owners of the land, on which we are operating. Yeah, so just as Sarah mentioned, just before I go to my presentation, just a little bit, I'm excited today because I've also received that official email that says I have completed my PhD, which is a great feeling. Yeah, I can tell you that it's a great feeling. So yeah, at the moment I'm working for former DPC, which is Department of Premier and Cabinet, and now restructured into Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, working as a program partnerships coordinator. Yeah, I'm just sharing my slides. That's okay. Just a minute. Okay. All right. So can you see Sarah? Okay, good. Thank you. So yeah, so I'm happy to be here today and excited. This is, I think, a great topic, and refugee and migration policy and how to partner with policymakers. But without further ado, I'll just go to the first slide. Working with alongside industry partners, and I think thinking of this industry and academia, the first thing that
hey Gershu.
Yep.
Sorry, can you just click on slideshow and or maybe just make it full screen, because it's not full screen down the bottom next to the Zoom.
You can't?
Perfect.
Can you see it now?
Thanks for that. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. So the first thing that you know, when we think of working alongside industry partners, I think the first thing that I experienced from my experience was that the different dynamics between academia and industry. So spending time over 7 years for me in academia and then joining the industry, the first thing that I noticed was actually, first thing, I completed my work at 5 o'clock, which is, this doesn't happen as a PhD student. So there's a different in terms of work culture, flexibility, and the level of kind of impact and support. So in academia, there's a huge sense of individual autonomy, where the project is really left to us in a way. But when industry, there's a larger shared goals and team work and team benchmarks to work with. And in terms of flexibility, relatively academia, I would say it's flexible. Again, it depends on the kind of supervisor you are working with, but I guess in industry, it's a bit more structured, where the goals, what to achieve and things like that. And in terms of impact, the level of impact is also in academia a bit more long-term, whereas in industry, it's immediate. You have something to do and you expect that output. You are expected to deliver that output. Also, the level of support. So I would say in academia, there's this independence. We're more independent in terms of the project it's your project, you have to do it. Whereas industry, there are clear individual and team tasks to work, and there's the team support. So these are like that was my first impression when I'm 3 months or 4 months into my role now, but it's already clear for me the difference, that there are different dynamics to work when we think of industry and academia. So another question that comes to mind is the role and relationship between research and advocacy and policy development. So when we ask, why do we need actually research? We need research for proof and convincing. We want to show that, okay, this is the problem, this is the magnitude of the problem, and this is the extent of the problem. And so it can provide an authoritative evidence. And traditionally, I guess, there's this assumption that research, advocacy, and policy as a kind of linear process where, okay, we have data, we have research, And based off that research, we advocate for certain policy change or policy influence. And then that's kind of thought as a linear process. Whereas research is not really a linear process because one influences the other. We could actually talk about research and then policy and advocacy as a circular kind of process, which is being co-produced. So this co-production, research influence advocacy, advocacy likewise influences research, and research vice versa. So there's this interactive co-production process, and we know that how much politics also shape knowledge production and use. And so I think these dynamics need to be taken into account when we are thinking of research, advocacy, and policy. So when we engage with industries involved in migration and policy research, and I have started thinking in terms of, what are the practical ways of engaging with such kind of industry, especially organizations that work directly with migrants or refugee or CALD communities. So I guess the first thing is we need to reorient our research questions towards addressing a current issue. So what is the pressing problem at the moment? What is actually happening? And then we identify who are working in that specific area, who are directly addressing those communities. And the next one, okay, now we have reframe. If we are interested in working for industry, obviously we need to reorient our kind of questions generally towards addressing this cause, and then identifying these organizations, and then we need to really prepare a well-crafted kind of snippet that describes our research in few non-academic words. So when I was asked what my research is about, I rambled around and I struggled a bit because my work is have very conceptual abstract elements. I was dealing with time, and I was looking at these big philosophers like Kant and Heidegger and other big thinkers, and I was talking about temporalities and what are temporalities for end users, for people who are not in academia. So really preparing a well-crafted kind of what is the gist of your research that describes your research in few non-academic words. That's our verbal business card. Once we have that, we can involve in conferences and networks, groups like TASA and Monash Migration Inclusion Center, or other networks, migration networks. That really helps to build up our profile, as well as just to be in that field. And then the next is obviously we need to tailor our verbal business card to the industry we are engaging with, because industry to industry, it's different. So how do we speak to policy? So we often talk about policy, research, and migration, but I think the first thing to note is we need to understand policy people are different from academic people. They're interested in simple, actionable, succinct language. We have to differentiate abstract concepts and theories from deliverables. What are we actually looking at? So my current manager, I report to a policy person, which is his official title is senior policy officer. So the policy, research, and advocacy we can group them in a similar way, but they're actually very different, and we need to speak to them in different dynamics. It's not that policy makers or policy people are not interested in theories or, what's that theory of multiculturalism, but it's just they're not as interested, our supervisors, they're not interested in our literature review, not in the conceptual framework, not method. So what are those actionable items, present some succinct language. And I guess the other thing is also our research needs to be accessible to everyone. And I guess the problem that we often experience, including myself, is that we don't let the research speak for itself. There's a tendency to drag it, just force it to speak to policy without really being built up. So I guess we need to clearly show the missing link through our data and analysis, and not really, we shouldn't leave it as a footnote down there at the end, policy implication. We often say at the end, policy implication, without really having been built. It doesn't really speak to policy, but we force it. I think we need to make this into consideration if we are. And I understand that all research doesn't necessarily have to speak to policy. But how do we speak to that language? So I guess there's this metaphor where when you merge into a freeway, there is a flow. Hundreds of thousands of cars are coming. They're flowing to the same direction. So when you merge into the highway, you have to manage your speed and what's already happening there. You have to align yourself into the flow. And I think it's the same with research, because there's always something happening. What is the current issue? What is being discussed? So I think aligning our research with what's already happening is a great way to speak to the current policy issues and relate those problems to the current industry policy strategies. How are people doing? What are they doing? And how what is the currency? So we need to speak their language. Another thing we need to be aware of, I guess, is when we often use policymakers, but it is a very loosely used term. Who are we specifically referring to? Are we talking about government officers, or are we looking at legislators, or are these policy officers in local government, or in policy officers in public affairs? Who are actually these people? We need to be specific enough. If we want to engage, we need to be specific enough to address kind of tangible outcome. So that's at the background knowledge, research and policy. There is a gap between the knowledge produced and its application to address issues to end users. This is already the research out there. All the research doesn't reach to the end user, so there is this gap. So our role could be, using easy to grasp visuals and brief summaries and stories to be able to address this gap. And I think it's very important to be aware of our resume, our CV is the crucial way to kind of present ourselves out there, like to make ourselves available. We have to take a good amount of time and effort and energy to be able to craft a good resume, which speaks to different industries differently. But we often leave, CV after we finish our PhD or after we're done with everything. But I think getting involved early, you are making your CV or your resume now, not later. So if you are like first year PhD student or second year or whatever, there is no better time than now. So now you can make your CV, you can start building your CV at the moment. It's not something to leave it for later. So even when communicating, I think we need to clarify, for example, if you are talking with a industry partner, with someone from policy, ask them clearly whether they want a CV or resume. Do they need like a comprehensive list of your academic credentials and your achievements and awards, or they just need the relevant resume. Ask them directly, so that really helps. And I would say take the professional development training seriously. There are a lot of skills that we can gain from this professional development training. Like, I'm assuming there will be in other universities as well, but in Monash, for example, there's Monash Professional Development Training Program. So they have very, those are very important skills that we can actually note down in our CV and then make use of them. And just a tip, also do not be afraid to go beyond your area, beyond your discipline. We have a lot of transferable skills. And so, yeah, you can go to another discipline area, and that actually works very well. I work in the health sector at the moment. I'm not a health professional, but I work in the health sector. And also, this is, I can't stress enough, if you want to be employable in industry, you have to find the catchphrases. What are the specific languages that they use? If they use CALD, use CALD, not multicultural. Or if they use specific language, use those specific languages. And that shows actually that you understand the organization and you're adaptable to the change that they aspire. So use their specific language. A lot of industry work in migration, I guess, is around project management. So you would have a project to deliver on. So project management skills are key. So work on project management skills, let's say project planning or monitoring and evaluation, maybe acquittal, and this kind of project management skills. These are very, very important. Often these lead you to the industry that you want. Yes, you need to have skills, but you have to be really tactical about how you present them. That's what takes you. Unfortunately, that's a lot of skilled people don't get their desired maybe job or employment, or they don't join the desired industry because they lack that tactic. So I would say, as important as skills, tactics are very, very important. Yes, so these are some of the tips that I can give, but obviously I'm happy to raise any questions that you may have. I can speak to my experience, but thanks for your time. Yeah.
Thank you, Goshu. That was wonderful. Thank you. And we'll give time, obviously, for some questions at the end. But first, we want to get through all the speakers. So I would second up like to welcome Dr. David Radford from the University of South Australia. So David is a senior lecturer and research degree coordinator at UniSA, Justice and Society. David's present research projects include exploring the impact and contributions of refugee background migrants in society and the role of refugee parents' educational aspirations on their children's academic outcomes. So David has previously researched the role of local government leadership in managing and promoting diversity and the complex ways that Hazaras negotiate their multiple identities as Aussie Afghans. David's previous positions include the Senior Research Fellow at the Hawke Research Institute for UniSA and lecturer in International Relations at Flinders University with a focus on Middle East and Central Asia. So without further ado, thank you, David. Take it away.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to acknowledge TASA MEM and the opportunity to be able to share with you today and a little bit of my own experience in relationship to working with industry and community. So I'll just go ahead, given our time constraints, and just share my power presentation. Is that coming up, Sarah? I can't see it on my computer. Great. I think one of the things as we think about researching humanitarian background migrants is the fact that we want our research to have impact. And if we want to have impact, and if we want to make a difference, then we need to engage as academics with community, and in particularly identifying community partners that for us are involved and engaged in this space, whether in providing services in relationship to supporting humanitarian background migrants or indeed policymakers. And of course, this varies from government departments and agencies, and of course to local groups and organizations, not-for-profits, charity groups, peak bodies that are engaged in this, and also local government councils. And I do want to kind of orientate what I'm going to share, particularly in regards to engaging with community or industry partners. And I've thought about this, and just kind of the basis for what I'm going to share comes from issues related to how we work and engage with humanitarian background migrants. And there's been a lot of work looking at the ethical and methodological challenges with this, but there's two questions that really undergird the work that I have been doing and seek to do in this space. And the first one is this: how does the research I'm doing benefit humanitarian background participants in the community? And the second one is, how can we avoid as researchers seeing humanitarian background participants as objects of study, but rather participants who engage with us in the research? Certainly, I have begun to hear of concerns that some community groups, organizations expressing hesitation working with academics in relationship to humanitarian background migrants because of these issues, that sometimes academics are seen to potentially use humanitarian background migrants for their research purposes, but they're not really engaged with and for the benefit of the participants themselves. So if we are going to enter into this space as academics, then it's really important that we also make sure that this both undergirds our engagement with humanitarian migrants as participants, but I suggest that these are also key if we are to work with community partners. And so I've called this researching with community partners. Just like we need to see humanitarian background migrants as those we research with, we need to do the same with community partners, and seeing them as co-collaborators, co-partners in the research process, particularly if we're thinking of having impact. And one of the ways that we do that is, as we identify community partners, that we see them giving input in the design, implementation, and follow-through of our research. And that means that we draw on the insight, experience, and knowledge that they have that we don't have. They are engaged on the ground in this space. And if our research is to have impact, then we need to recognize and draw on that. Community partners have strong relational capital with humanitarian background migrant communities. They often are the ones who are able to understand the communities better than we do, and to draw on their advice is really key. Certainly in a recent project, we were looking at the contribution of humanitarian background migrants to local communities. It became clear that there were complexities, differences, and tensions within the humanitarian background migrant community. And it was the advice and counsel of our community partner that enabled us to help minimize potential negative effects if we were unaware of the fact that there were these complexities. But their advice and counsel helped us navigate that process. Another thing that I think it's important when we research with community partners is that we sometimes come to community partners with a clear idea of what we want to do as academics. And I think Goshu mentioned this in his presentation, but learning for us, coming alongside community partners and understanding their perceived need, the issues that they want addressed, the issues that they understand and know in the community, and talking with them about the ways that our skills and ideas about what we think would be important, how the two can align together. And this was certainly highlighted to me in a recent project which some colleagues and I have begun to look at, taking the work we've done in Adelaide with the contributions of humanitarian background migrants to local communities and wanting to explore this in a rural or regional context. We had a potential community partner in a larger town in New South Wales. And when we talked with them about the kinds of projects, we were thinking maybe this larger town was the place we were supposed to do the work. But we wanted to hear what they had to say. And in fact, they redirected our research to say, identify the need of smaller country towns, and in particular, one in particular that they saw as an area of need, particularly the perceived need, and again, Goshu mentioned this, empirical evidence to help inform policymakers regarding issues. And this, in this particular case, it was increasing government policy towards settling humanitarian background migrants in rural and regional areas, and government coming to community providers like this potential partner for us, and the community partner saying, well, we would like evidence that we could engage and negotiate and talk with government so that we can get the best result for local communities. And it completely redirected our research to another location. The other benefit was that this community partner then introduced us into the community, introduced us to local government council and other key stakeholders, which opened doors that otherwise we would not have. Research also, as we engage with community partners, needs to be one that benefits them. And I guess this draws on my last point about our research being focused towards meeting the expressed needs that they see for themselves and their community. But we need to be explicitly asking ourselves as academics, how will our research findings and the process benefit our community partners? How will our community partners be acknowledged and promoted through research outputs and dissemination? So both in terms of our findings and in the way we communicate them. And this involves communication. And I think our engagement with community partners is going to involve keeping our partners up to date regularly, involving them, as I said earlier, in the design and implementation of the research, but also keeping up good communication, especially where research takes place over time. And thinking about research outputs, Goshu mentioned this in terms of the kind of language we use. In a project that we see, which is the report on this slide, Refugees, Rejuvenating and Connecting Communities, our academic report ended up being 140 pages, and we recognized this is going to be very good for some audiences, but not for others. It included the kind of language we used in that report. So what we ended up doing was then producing a kind of 50-page glossy report, which is what you can see there, with some really nice pictures and making a good attempt at trying to use everyday language that spoke clearly and to the point. We actually had a third output, which was a interactive web version of the report, which you can see the link below, which is again just an easy way of communicating our research findings, but also making sure that our community partners are very much central and promoted through this. It's not just about the universities involved, but the community partners as clearly a part of and in the promotion of the research. It's also key because community partners have experience with promoting research. If our research is to impact policy, if it's going to make a difference to those groups supporting humanitarian background migrants, then they are engaged genuinely with our partners, means that they will often give advice regarding how that dissemination can take place. And community partners often have relationships into various government departments and other peak bodies who would benefit from the research that we were doing. And we certainly found this was through our community partner. They were very helpful in telling us who we should be inviting and engaging in terms of the launch of the report, including members of parliament, including leaders of peak bodies who came and participated in the report. And in fact, one of the things we realize is that while we want to influence policy, sometimes we are not the ones, but it's others, community groups and others who take the reports and findings that we have in our research and actually are the ones who are able to influence. And a member of parliament who attended our launch took the report and actually shared a summary of the report, for instance, in parliament. And the way the report then is able to be picked up through contacts and networks that your community partners can provide. I want to just briefly touch on the role of local government authority and encourage HDRs and ECRs and others to see local governments as really key partners, potential community partners in engaging with humanitarian background migrants. One of the things that became very clear to me in earlier research I did is that local governments, and particularly the role of the mayor, are so influential in creating either positive environments that's going to facilitate and support humanitarian background migrants in their community, or who are going to provide negative environments. And so I've made it a point in some of the research that I'm doing, both here in Adelaide and in rural towns, to actually meet with the mayor, meet with the local council, and whether it's the CEO, the community development officer, and talk about the kinds of research we're engaged with. Remember, we as academic researchers are in their space. We are in their communities, engaging with their community, different parts of that community. And so to be able to either have them as a direct partner, or certainly going back to them and engaging them in our work is very important. And certainly I found that in rural and regional towns, where the council opened up doors of relationship both into the humanitarian migrant community and in voices across the community, whether they be negative or positive. And those kinds of doors are hugely important. And of course, it also, that ongoing relationship with local government councils often means that this is another area of policy, of implementation, that they can take your findings where you have built that relationship and allow that to impact their council initiatives as well. And just finally, I just want to suggest that we also consider media as a potential community partner. When we're looking at impact, even the potential to impact policy, it's the communication of your research that can come with community partners, and seeing media as that. So certainly our community partner research project was able to put us in touch, for instance, with ABC Radio and contacts that they had who they thought would be interested in the report that we were doing, and to be able to give it exposure. One of the things that was not a direct intentional implementation on our part, that came out as this report became much more public, was the way, for instance, SBS language services, in this case, because our focus was on the Hazara Afghan community, their Persian language or Dari language service picked up on the report and then did their own article from it onto their Facebook page. And I found out this was taking the impact of our research and taking it to a whole nother level in the community. And this, in this case, they had 300,000 people across Australia and across the world in our particular report, at the point at which this was taken, over 40,000 people had engaged with it. In fact, we were getting communication back from the Hazara community, from Afghanistan, contacting the Hazara community in Australia saying, have you heard about this report about the Hazara community? So the potential for media to actually act as an opportunity to influence the community and the public, I think, is really key. And as academics, sometimes we can shy away from the media, but they can be a partner, whether indirectly or directly, in being able to disseminate the findings of our research and have the potential to impact and promote the use of this research with policy. And in fact, SBS World News also took up this project and used it as a way to address the government's budget on migration. So it's not just, again, how we use it, but how others can use it to impact policy. So I'll leave it there. It's just some of my own experiences working with community partners.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. There's always one. Thank you very much, David. That's fantastic. And there's so much to unpack in here, and I can't wait for we get a moment to do the questions and answers. But of course, the time we have to move ahead, and so lastly, I would really like to thank our next presenter, which is Annabelle. And Annabelle, sorry, give me a moment. I seem to have lost my screen. So if you just give me a moment. For those who are watching the recording, they'll lovely get to miss out on this point.
Sarah, would you like me to stop sharing?
No, it's quite all right. Just I'll be 2 seconds. Just wanted to introduce Annabelle to everyone. So Annabelle is a program director, at the Center for Policy Development. She has had an oversight of programming and policy development related to forced migration and settlement, employment and economic participation, and service system reform and place-based approaches. So Annabelle is an experienced advisor and facilitator with over 20 years of experience supporting effective social and economic development in Australia and the Asia Pacific. Annabelle's particular expertise leading research and evaluation projects focused on understanding policy influence, advocacy, leadership development, governance, accountability, and empowerment. She is passionate about generating knowledge through collaborative processes and using that to improve policy and practice. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce Annabelle to this presentation and thank her for her time. So take it away, Annabelle, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Sarah. For one moment, I was worried I was going to have to introduce myself. Suddenly forgot all of the details about my life and expertise. Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks to TASA MEM and also CONREP for convening this conversation. Thanks to Goshu and David for preceding me and with some really important insights and ideas, which I'm happy to try to build on. And thanks, of course, to everyone here listening. I'll tell you a little bit more about me and where I'm sort of positioned within all of this a little bit later, but first, the Centre for Policy Development, in case anyone doesn't know, we're an independent Australian policy institute. We don't have any affiliation with an institution or any particular political persuasion. We've got offices in Sydney and Melbourne. Predominantly, we're funded by philanthropy, a little bit from the private sector and much less so from government. We keep that as a very small percentage, generally speaking. We've had over the last 6 years or so 2 large initiatives that have looked at migration and settlement issues. So the first that's been running for 6 years now is the Asia Dialogue on Forced Migration. I came into CPD on this program. It's a dialogue between policymakers and shapers from over 9 countries across the Indo-Pacific on forced migration issues. It engages relatively high-level policymakers, so former ministers, ambassadors, deputy secretaries across multiple ministries, along with international UN agencies and civil society and other, including academics. The Cities and Settlement Initiative is the second large-scale initiative that's been over the last 3 to 4 years. It's focused on trying to boost economic participation for refugees and people with refugee backgrounds, recognising that this is one of the weakest links in Australia's settlement experience. So that's brought together local, state and Commonwealth government officials around this issue of economic participation, but also alongside private sector actors and civil society. So both these initiatives have a dialogue or convening component to them, and they also have research streams. So a lot of what we do is shaping policy research findings for a conversation between policymakers and influencers. So within that context, I think the most important things that we've learnt, and certainly really building on Goshu's experience and insights here, I was very jealous that he'd actually managed to make up an acronym for his insights already. I'm going to have to pick up my game on that front. So probably the three most important things is really finding a topic of common interest. So a topic that unites across jurisdictions, across stakeholder groups, where there's some immediate need and an appetite for doing something. So I think refugee economic participation was probably a good example of this. There are multiple ministries and departments involved. I think when we started the Cities and Settlement Initiative, there were 6 different ministers, their offices and departments engaged, and that was just at the Commonwealth level, let alone state and local. But refugee economic participation and the need to get that right earlier in the settlement journey was essentially of interest to everybody involved. And it was immediately relevant to the policy agendas, and there was also leadership that were interested in taking it forward. I think the second most important thing is opportune timing, and so this is injecting those insights, evidence, research at the right time. And I think Goshu's highway metaphor was really a good one. I think working on the timelines of the people that you're seeking to influence is hugely important as well. An example, I think, of us almost getting that right was assisting the co-chairs of the Bali process on people smuggling, trafficking in persons and related transnational crime, to trigger the consultation mechanism that they had previously set up in response to the mass displacement of the Rohingya from Myanmar in 2017. So we happened to be having a dialogue meeting at at a time, was probably the first time that senior officials were able to come together and discuss potential responses in a safe environment. And we were able to bring some relatively pragmatic examples of successful and useful collective and regional action that could be taken, and also how that could be done in a policy toolkit. So I think the third area that's really important is to tell a good story about a good idea. So coalescing the evidence and shaping it into a compelling story about the change that you're seeking is super important. Why it's needed, the benefits that will flow. Most importantly, as I think David has spoken about, the benefits that will flow to the people who are most affected. So telling that personal story with using as much as possible the voice of those impacted, but also telling the benefits to governments, stakeholders. We've also found not just telling a story about why to do it, but also how to do it is very important as well, and can make the difference between getting people to act. So as Goshu said, being succinct to the point, with a strong emphasis on a small number of must-haves. And so you need to really know what you're asking for and why that's important. A perfect theoretical solution is not perfect if it's simply not feasible for anyone to do. I think an example of this was telling the story of the kind of reforms that were needed in the service systems that support economic participation, so employment service systems, settlement, by really telling the story from the perspective of two communities in Australia, working with people with refugee backgrounds to really give voice to their experience of interacting with the service systems, and then using that as the basis for arguing for place-based and locally led approaches to joined up service delivery. Perhaps an example of when all of these things come together, so the timing, the storytelling, and the getting the right topic, was when we actually got some traction for a place-based and locally led service response, particularly with Department of Employment Skills Education Skills and Employment, was post the COVID pandemic, when we could really show its timely application of these sorts of models and approaches, that their time had come, and also show the broad benefits for all job seekers facing barriers, including, of course, people with diverse ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, but also people with disability, people in contact with the justice system, and others facing barriers. So in this work that we do, we work with researchers in a number of different ways. So research to support that convening work, as I said. So getting groups of stakeholders around a policy problem or issue. So that needs to be short, concise, constructive, framed in a way that encourages or paves the way for progress. So we've worked with academics, policy institutes, NGOs in putting those sorts of pieces together. Also support to, research to support policy development. So contextualising, characterising particular policy challenges, programming areas, and proposing ideas, solutions, reform opportunities. We've worked with research associates, academics, fellows, etc. on those sorts of streams. And then also research to support program development. So for instance, in evaluation and design of our programming. So we've been scoping some new areas of work for CPD, for instance, and considering what we've learnt from previous experience strengths, weaknesses, those sorts of things, which research is really important in that. So there's, I guess, a few different avenues into working as a researcher with and for industry partners such as CPD. Just quickly on me, so I've got a Bachelor of Arts background, philosophy, English literature, politics, so a pretty classic education, critical thinking, research, constructive arguments. We had t-shirts made at my university for art students that read unemployable but happy. So that's my background. I also did a master's in international development, which was obviously more in the social sciences, looking at macroeconomic, social, political dimensions of development, with a pragmatic twist. And I think, again, Goshu's point around this is really important. My thesis was on evaluation of advocacy work of Oxfam. And I ended up working with Oxfam with both program management but also program development. So the research with Oxfam was around program design, evaluation, learning, a lot of facilitation and convening work, as well as obviously written. I've also done some consulting with the broader aid development, social justice sectors, again with research, evaluation, program development work, and then finally the Centre for Policy Development over the last 6 years. So I think the sorts of skills that I know I've utilised regularly and also really valued in others that I think come from a research background are really the critical thinking and the depth of analysis, framing and sorting ideas, problem solving and creative thinking. I think this is often not highlighted, but I think facilitation, the sort of skills that you gain in facilitation through small and large group work, facilitating people through processes of analysis and learning are really important skills and can be applied really broadly. Also just methodological approaches, so interviewing techniques, using open questions, some of those basics I think that we learn in research and then probably don't value, but are actually critically important in industry. Qualitative and quantitative data analysis and being able to mix the two, recognising limitations of methodologies and how that influences the evidence and potential solutions, and of course writing, so succinctly, clearly and persuasively, and most importantly to an audience, to a particular audience. So some more kind of personal reflections, I guess, on what the sorts of skills that you can really generate and highlight. Thanks.
That's wonderful, Annabelle. Thank you so much for that. And apologies for the delay and making you feel a little bit alarmed that you might have to introduce yourself. But yes, so thank you again for your presentation, and a really big thank you to all the presenters for their contributions. I personally feel like I've learned a lot from Goshu, the acronym of RIP It Up. I'm going to take that and park that one and keep it in my back pocket for later, as well as, the getting in early, the CV and experience. And David, I've really enjoyed talking about how much you've engaged with the community in the research, and community partners and your participants as well, and ensuring that that space is being given for people to voice, and with local government. And Annabelle, thank you very much for the tips you've given around the topic of picking a topic of common interest, the timing, and then telling a good story about a good idea. So this is all very helpful, and I appreciate all of it. So if I'd like to open up the floor now for people to ask some questions. So first, what we're going to do is start with some questions posted in the chat. And so there's a question here. There's a few comments as well from many people throughout around engaging and co-authoring and cooperating with our participants. But a question from Suzanne for Goshu is, how do you negotiate the often toxic politics around refugees with policymakers who are influenced by negative political discourse used by politicians? And I guess this could actually go to many of the panelists who've worked in this space as well. But would you like to kick it off, Goshu?
Yeah, was that Suzanne?
Yes.
Suzanne, don't ask a very difficult question, please. That's a very good question, I guess, to ask. And I think you are absolutely right, especially with the current political climate is not ideal in terms of advocacy work for refugees. But I think again that's why research is important. Like if we do research to convince others, like if we have data and then if we present it in a way it's convincing them without really being going to their territories, we can still be able to make the point. We have to show them that, I think we can show them that the research that is available on the significance of the issue, the magnitude of the issue, if it is if we do it for advocacy purposes, then if it is convincing enough, then that's where the relationship between advocacy, policy, and research comes in again. And so we can't avoid, I personally think we can't avoid those kind of people in every setting, even in the community setting. We, in my short kind of industry experience, I have faced, those kind of people who are not really into, okay, so this is a toxic political climate, or they are in that bandwagon, but still, if it is convincing, if we can show them that the magnitude and the scale of the problem, then there is some way of reducing that burden. But again, yeah, I understand your concern. Maybe I'll leave it to Annabelle and David.
Thank you. Yeah, David, I know that you've had this experience as well with your the recent report that you released that was working with local governments and things like that. So how did you navigate this narrative in the report?
Well, actually, it was very explicit with the report, because the report was deliberately focused around framing humanitarian background migrant contributions as social, cultural, and economic, rather than simply as we need to evaluate their role economically. And it was also specifically, the rationale for it was around the discourses that Suzanne mentioned, that refugee background migrants as a burden, a threat, or unable or unwilling to integrate or become part of the local community. And I think part of the way our approach was, together with our community partner, looking at a compelling story. And I think Annabelle mentioned this in terms of the value of the research. And I think one of the things that this recent project highlighted to me was providing compelling stories based on evidence-based research that allows to tell an alternative discourse. And I think, and then that's where partly, we weren't directly engaging with policy makers in terms of policy, but they became part of that process in terms of the dissemination of this report from state government departments, taking the reports back, but also the way in which the story has been disseminated by the media. And the fact that there was a compelling, positive story that was taken up right across all forms of media and providing other opportunities to understand that there is a different story out there, and one that is actually based on empirical evidence. that was grounded in what was actually happening, not the kind of discourses that were taking place. And I think this is where an engagement with media can be positive. And that was certainly very much the case. And also providing forms of dissemination, which we've talked about, both Goshu and Annabelle, in the language that can be understood by anybody, the public or indeed, you know, policymakers. So I think that it certainly worked well in our last report.
Thank you, David. Did you have anything else you'd like to add, Annabelle, before we move to the next question?
I think I agree with Goshu and David. I suppose we see those political or ideological arguments as arguments that it's simply not possible to win. I mean, that's essentially, they're set up in that way, you know, so they're necessarily oppositional. And so I think just as David said, sort of striking to the heart of them, while also essentially skirting around them. And that sounds complicated, but really those ideological and political battles will play out on the edges of what you're doing. But really, if you tell a compelling story about change and why it's needed, with those personal accounts really coming through to the fore, encouraging human connection around a common issue, then really they fall away, those sorts of political arguments.
Thank you, everyone. I'll probably just do one more question before we start to give a final summary of today. But Kay does ask, how do researchers keep themselves accountable for called communities who co-designed, implemented research projects that are later on not funded to continue on? And this is probably a tricky question, but even one that I can apply to PhD students as well in co-designing and accountability on the research that's being produced and how to hold on to. So I'm not sure if anyone would like to kick off with that response.
I can speak to that. So recently I was part of, well, as someone who came from academia to the industry, the first thing that I did was that, you know, conducting a community consultation across the LGAs that I work with. And so we were designing projects, but I think if we clearly set the expectation, if we clearly set the goals and agree with, you know, when we design in the process of co-designing, we need to clearly mention that, you know, this is, we are trying our best to get funding or to achieve what we can do, but, you know, show those outcomes, and from the outset, let them know what to expect, because we don't want, at the end of the day, because we're going to work with them and we don't want to over-promise and under-deliver. So I think it's good to have a clear set expectation. Just to add that. Thank you.
I think this is a really good question. And from an academic point of view, a very challenging question. How do we keep ourselves accountable to the communities that we're engaged with? And I think that comes back to the heart of one of those two questions that I suggested at the beginning should undergird our research as academics, whether as HDRs, ECRs, or indeed those of us who've been researching for longer periods, is how do we continue relationships after our project is ended and after the funding has come to an end? There's no easy answer to that, except I think it is important to keep those connections and building on them. And I would like to suggest that this is both with the cold or humanitarian migrant background communities, as well as your community partners. I think both issues are valid. It's one thing to work with a community partner and then not engage with them for periods afterwards. but finding ways to connect with both communities, it takes work and it takes effort. There's no easy answer to this, except it will have long-term benefits for the community, for your community partner, and for you as a researcher. Because if you are able to maintain those connections, then years on, there are opportunities to re-engage back with the community, to re-engage back with those community partners, because the relationships you've developed have been genuine. And it does require work, but I think finding ways, whether it's funded or not, to continue the relationship, I think will be a real benefit to all those involved in that process. And I've certainly experienced that with projects that I've engaged with, that I have found ways to keep coming back. And I think as a researcher, that's the other thing. How can you find ways to keep coming back to the community you've been involved with, to re-engage, or coming back to community partners? And because you've built that relationship, there's trust that allows you to re-engage in other kinds of ways.
Thank you.
Maybe just to add, I think it's a really, really important question, and I think we always need to keep it at the forefront of our minds. And just to reflect that it gets harder and harder the further up the kind of policy chain you move. So answering this kind of question in relation to the Asia Dialogue on Forced Migration, for instance, and that kind of level of dialogue between those sorts of policymakers. So how to sort of stay true to that voice of forced migrants in that kind of context is hugely difficult. But something, yeah, that it's really important to keep in mind how you're representing that voice if you've been given the privilege and the task of presenting that voice in those sorts of forums, how you are making space for people to be part of the discussions, not just the subjects of discussions. We have to keep on asking ourselves those questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a quick sneaky question before I know I said that we probably didn't have much time, but one before we kind of get your last minute advice is around this idea of when PhD students are entering into the field and they're trying to engage with industry. Is there a tip or advice you give on how they do that, this asking of industry partners? And in developing, and is there, I guess you could, if you'd like to start, Annabelle, with if you've been approached by PhD students in the past who've emailed you and contacted you, what's the best way that they might do that? And what is that relationship look like afterwards?
That's a great question. I think probably what would pique my interest in if someone was approaching me would be really some sort of demonstration that they knew what we were trying to do. They had a good sense of what they were trying to do, and they were really interested in the intersection between the two. You know, I think that would really show me that that they would have the interest, the experience, that they'd be coming from the right place, but also have the kind of flexibility and adaptability to understand how it might work with what we're doing. I think that would be an ideal approach.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you have any reflections as well, David or Goshu, before.
My advice probably would be, or tip, is if you're as an HDR, either through your supervisors or others who have relationship with some of these community organizations or groups, to introduce you to somebody in the organization. So finding somebody who has a relationship that can introduce you, I think would be really helpful. I know that is not always the case, in which case arranging a face-to-face meeting with somebody in that organization would be my next tip. While you might be contacting them in various ways, I think the best tip I could give is to try to arrange a face-to-face meeting and looking for the right person in the right position in the organization to approach, and not don't limit it to phone calls or emails or other forms, but actually get a face-to-face opportunity to engage and share your compelling story and understanding their story.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, my experience is a little bit different because I haven't approached anyone for the job. Yeah, as I was approaching to my PhD submission, so I was supposed to submit in January, and I've started looking for jobs 3 months earlier. And so, as I've mentioned in my earlier presentation, I kind of listed out the organizations that I can potentially work for, and I have no any information about the organization that I was working right now. But as I was looking for those organizations, I came across this organization. Oh, and I said, "Ooh, they seemed interesting. They work on migration, settlement, and refugee background people. Sounds interesting." I would never have seen this organization because I would consider it as a health service provider. Just they have GP services, they have psychotherapy and things like that, and it's nowhere near to my kind of expertise. But there is this huge component that they're not even directly giving it. They're just hosting the Victoria government program. So it's basically, yeah, Department of Premier and Cabinet. So I have applied and also have applied a couple of others. Unfortunately, I was able to get 2 of them, and I had to actually ask my supervisor for help to help me able to decide, which one would be better for me. Do you suggest this one, not that one? And then, obviously we ended up being here. But so, and I think as much as making those connections is important, it's also important to spend time and research what kind of organizations are out there and how can you actually, I said about tactics earlier, and those tactics are really not so much about your skills. You already have skills. Don't get me wrong. You have a PhD, you have whatever it takes. You have everything. Because if you have done your PhD, you have this project management experience. You have done your own project. You implemented your own project. You set a timeline. You monitored and evaluated yourself. It's a great way to demonstrate that you are capable of implementing and managing a project. Okay, so you can do that, but just it has to be, you have to speak their language again. If you are a policy, speak the policy language. If you are in the industry, speak those specific languages that they are using in the day-to-day operation. And I guess if you make yourself presentable, and usually, yeah, of course, these references are important, but also just finding out what is out there and then explore, just do a little bit of research in terms of who can employ you. And that's been my experience with that, if that makes sense.
Yes, great. Thank you, Goshu. So I appreciate all of your responses today. And I guess just 1 minute word of advice. So if you could provide a 1 minute comment and I know that you've provided so much advice to us now, but if you have one word for migration scholars earlier in the career who are trying to develop partnerships with industry, what would it be? 1 word of advice. And so just 1 minute each, if that's all right. Perhaps David, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think something that I think has come across all 3 presentations is to try to come alongside and understand community partners' their needs or the needs that they perceive are needed, and align some of your thinking and ideas together with what community partners have, and aligning those together as much, and being flexible enough to adjust those things that you're wanting to do to align together, so it's a win-win for both. And I think, and then you have the greatest potential for having impact, whether it's policy or for the communities that you're engaged with.
Great, thank you. Annabelle, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think if I'm giving sort of one minute advice on engaging with the policy world and the policy process, I think it's really picking up on David and Goshu's point. So approach it like a piece of cross-cultural communication. And as you would with any other piece of cross-cultural communication, and this is between, and remember that it's between people who are actually interested in the same real world goals. They're interested in the same real world outcomes. It's just they're operating with different constraints and considerations. And so really focusing in on those and how you can be of mutual benefit to one another, I think is the key. And also perhaps just being open to surprising and unexpected pathways through. And I think both personally, in the choices that you make and the opportunities that you take, but also the broader pathways to reform, because they often come from unexpected places.
Thank you, Annabelle. And last but not least, Goshu.
All right, so I think I have my words out there. So is it repeat off or repeat up? What's the right term for this? I think that's going to be my term. Just reorient your research questions towards addressing a current issue, and identify list of organizations, potential employers, and prepare a well-crafted snippet that describes your research in non-academic language. I can't stress that enough. Always have just have that verbatim. Just this is my research, and then engage in. This is also very, very, very important in conferences, networks, and groups early, like TASA, MIC, or seminars. And so there are several reading groups and things like that. Join them. I mean, manage your time, of course, but also it's really important to join to be able to know. Some of my best friends so far are the ones who I met them in conference, or those are like they go lifetime. So these are very, very important. And so the last one is tailor your verbal business card. That's your verbal business card to the industry that you are working. So repeat. So this is my word. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Goshu. I love a good acronym, something to take away. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join us for this session today. As a reminder, many people requested recordings for today's session, so that will be made available. Big thank you to Dr. Tamara Tabokovic and the team at CONREP as well for their partnership. And we have Basil Mehta from the University of Melbourne for his help with the Zoom session today, so thank you very much, Basil. Big thank you to the speakers, obviously, Annabelle Brown, Goshu Tefera, and Dr. David Radford, thank you. And to the MEM postgrad team, Claire, Yinghua, and Laura for their support, and TASA MEM, obviously, for their assistance in this event. So if you want to keep in the loop on future MEM events, we encourage you to subscribe to the MEM thematic newsletter or join TASA to be part of this great network. You can also find out about opening future conversations about sessions, and we're very excited to introduce the next one in July, which is titled Decolonizing Methodologies, Black, Indigenous, and Women of Color. So as PhD and ECR is engaged in sociological research, we must be aware of how our research design, execution, analysis may privilege Western ways of knowing and the harm it could have on participants and communities that we collaborate with. So in our July Conversations About panel, we're partnering with African Women Australia, and we'll welcome Dr. Virginia Mapitsahama and Dr. Sunshine Kamaloni and Dr. Ruth Valalelo to discuss their perspectives in relation to contemporary debate. So this panel will detail the experiences of decolonizing methodologies using their own research in migration, ethnicity, and multiculturalism space. And we hope to unpack and unsettle the research process, critically engage in conversations about Eurocentric imperial and colonial structures within our own ontological, epistemological, and theoretical approaches. So stay tuned as more information unfolds about this event. Once again, feel free, thank you for joining us. Any further questions, feel free to get in touch with us at TASA, at admin@tasa.org.au, or you can email me. And to the panelists, thank you. As a little small expression of gratitude, you'll receive a little email. You've all funded a emergency shelter with the UNHCR. So thank you very much. We hope that is palatable for all of you, or okay for all of you. But and so we wanted just to do a little something to thank you for your time. But yeah, so I hope everyone has learned something valuable to take with them today. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.